Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. In this session, we are going to start with the simplest example in Python. To basically learn Python syntax and get started as simply as possible. So first of all, we are going to write a very simple application that just print some output. And in Python, when we want to print, basically displays result of what we wrote, we use this syntax when we say print, and here we can pass in whatever we want to display. And now if I want to see whether this super simple application works, I can run it or execute it with this triangle here, and I have the output. So generally the output is displayed or printed right here, and I see the output is 5. I can display some other values like 500 and run it, and there you go. Let's say we want to display some text. So whatever some sentence and again triangle, and we have the output here, right? So again, a very simple example of writing Python code that generally displays some information when we execute it. One thing that I want to note here is you see that we write some code basically in this window right here. So in our main.py file, and when we run it or execute it, our code, we see some display in this window. So you may be wondering what is this window and why do we see some output right here? The answer to that is that whenever you are working with tools like PyCharm, which generally have all the functionality that you need to write your code and then execute your code, you have everything in one place. So whatever we write, we can execute or run right away. Now, without such tool, how would we write code and how would we execute that code? And this will help you understand what's going on here, and to show that I am going to go back to my terminal and we are going to write the same code. So here you can do it in a file editor. I'm just doing it directly in the command line, and we have Python 3 available locally. So now I get the same output in the command line. So what you see right here, this whole thing is integrated. So generally all in one place where you can write your code, the editor right here where you can navigate your files in your project. So this is just a folder on your laptop and you can navigate the files here, and you have the execution environment at the same time. So you have to go to terminal and execute Python 3. Whatever you have everything in one place, and tools that provide you with this type of environment for different programming languages. For Python, it happened to be PyCharm. These are called IDEs, which stand for Integrated Development Environment. Integrated because you have everything in one place, so you don't need to use a terminal. But in addition to this integration, you get more cool features which help you in writing Python code. For example, syntax, highlighting, errors or code suggestions, autocomplete suggestions, and we will see those cool features actually also throughout this course. So basically just makes your life as a developer easier. However, it's good to understand that connection between executing your files on the terminal when you don't have such a tool versus executing and working on your application instead that tool. So let's get back to our code, editor a file where we write our code, and till now we have done something really simple like print a text basically and print a number, right? And this leads to the first concept in programming language, which are data types. So in Python, Just like in any other programming language, you have data types for text and numbers. The text data types are called strings. So everything within the double quotes is basically a string. But note that in Python, you can also use a single quote for strings. So double quotes or single quotes, they both work the same, and there's actually no difference between them. And for number, we actually have different data types. So for whole numbers like 5, 50, but also 0 and negative number, as well as we have a data type called integer, and that's also how it's called in most programming language. However, you also have numbers for currency. For example, how much a product costs, right? So if you have an online shop, you would have prices like this. For example, so these are generally numbers with precision. This could also be, for example, when you are shipping something, you could have a weight of a package. That is also not a whole number, but has a precision. So these type of numbers in Python and many other programming languages are represented as float data type. So again, you have integers and float data types, and if we execute that, you generally see all the printed as we wrote them. Now, obviously, printing values like numbers and text like this doesn't make much sense unless we are getting some useful information from our simple program right here. So let's do something more useful with Python now. Let's clean all this up, and let's say we want to do some calculations using very simple logic that calculates how many minutes there are in 50 days. So we have 50 days which have 24 hours per day, which have 60 minutes per hour. So this line will give us calculation of minutes for 50 days, and there you go. That's our number. Now this makes a little bit more sense because now we have a program that actually does something for us. So as you see, you can do any math operations on number in Python, and again in many other programming languages you can do plus, minus, division, whatever, just like you know it from basic math. However, I want to note right here something that many people think about programming and maybe are misinformed about, which is if you're doing web development or maybe DevOps automation with Python and not something like data science or data analytics, this is probably an example of the highest math knowledge that you need for programming in Python. Because even though we are going to use some calculation examples, because they are just good as example to show you the basic concept of Python. You do not really need any advanced or even intermediate knowledge of mathematics when programming, because it's really not about math. However, what you need is logical thinking, and we are going to be doing some of that and see that as example. So just bear that in mind in case you are misinformed about that. So back to our example, we have this number that is displayed here as a result. However, maybe if we use this program, we don't remember or we don't know what this number stands for. If somebody else is using, so we want to add some descriptive information about this number that says this is how many minutes there are in 50 days. So we need a line that says 50 days are this many minutes, and this should basically be exactly this calculation right here. So how do we put this calculation? Right here in this middle so that we end up with this whole phrase displayed right here. So how do we combine text and number or calculation of number? And in programming language, again, this is not specific to Python. We would do that using something called string concatenation. And string concatenation is basically a fancy word for gluing together or combining multiple strings. Now, how does the syntax for that look like? We combine the string using plus sign. So, apart from adding numbers, obviously using plus is also used in programming for combining multiple strings. So, in our example, we have three string values and we want to put them all together in one string or one sentence. We have the first string 50 days, rn, then we have the second string minutes, and in the middle the third string which will be the value of the calculation. However, if we just put a number here, the Python interpreter tells us it's not a string, it's a number. So we need to turn it into a string. Other programming languages do that automatically. In Python, we need to do that explicitly. So we need to tell Python, take this number, but not as a number, but as a string. And we do that using a syntax that looks exactly like that. So we have a non-string value, but we are telling Python we want it as a string because it needs to be printed out as a text. So if I execute this line, let's see what happened. And there you go. We have our output just like we wrote it here, but you see that there are no spaces around. So 60 is just really glued together without any space around. And how do we put spaces around this 60? So add a space here, add a space here now. Why does that work? Because this whole thing for Python is a string. Again, because we are putting it within these quotes. So generally any character that you see on your keyboard right now, if you put in between those quotes, is interpreted by Python as a string, including this space character, right? So if we execute it again, we have spaces around 60 and our sentence, our phrase look fine. And if you are thinking right now, this is actually kind of annoying because first of all, it looks ugly and also there's a high chance you're gonna forget it. That is absolutely right. So in Python, again, specifically, there is a way to do it in a more elegant way using a different syntax, and the more elegant syntax for that. Let's write that again, and instead of having these plus, we have curly braces and we write our number inside or whatever non-textual value. And at the beginning, right here, basically before we start writing a string which start with quotes, we just write the letter F, and you see the syntax highlighting as well. So sees that this is not part of text. This is a non-text value, and if I execute it, I would see there's some output from the second line, and this is really a way cooler way to write this instead of using plus, but this is something very common and also something that you would encounter in most programming languages. So just important to know that this is a syntax for string concatenation as well. So we can just remove it and use this syntax for our examples. And also note that this syntax is actually a new addition to Python. So it only works if you have a latest Python version. In our project, if you remember, we actually configured and chose version 3.9, and that's why it works for us if you use Python 2, for example. Python version 2, this syntax is not going to work for you. We can actually demonstrate it. So I'm going to copy that line, and now if I execute it, you see it works fine. So this syntax actually only works for Python version starting from 3.6. So everything below that, every Python version will not recognize this syntax. So again, back to our code, and now we just have a number here, but what we actually want is the calculation for getting the correct result, right? So we want again 50 days in hours and then in minutes. And if I execute it, you see that the calculation was done, and here we have the full complete sentence with the result in it. And if you are curious, this F actually stands for format. So this is basically formatting our text or our string in a correct way. So we have this line of code here that calculates for us how many minutes there are in 50 days. Let's say we want to do the same for 30 days, right? What we can do is generally copy that line and replace the value for 50 with 30. And if I execute it, I get the same calculation but for 30 days. And we can do that multiple times for different values. So let's say we want it for 40 days and we want the same calculation for, I don't know, let's say 100 days. Doesn't really matter, and we have obviously different number of minutes for each of this value. And now let's say we wrote this program, it's ready and we are using it, and at some point we decide, what I want this program to actually calculate how many seconds there are for these provides days instead of minutes. So what we would need to do in that case, in generally change the calculation in all those 4 lines. So instead of minutes, I should actually calculate number of seconds in a day, right? So we have the hours, minutes and seconds, and we would have to change the text as well here, and we would need to do that for each one of those lines, right? So we would have it here like this. And again, if we need to modify this for hours or millisecond or whatever, we basically have to do these changes multiple times, right? Even though if you actually look at that, this is the same exact calculation for each line. That doesn't change, right? If you want second, then this is the calculation that you need to do. So how can we actually avoid repeating the same calculation and the same text in our code? And the answer to that is variables. So in programming languages, we have variables that hold values that will repeat throughout your code, that you can set once and use it in multiple different places. So instead of repeating this calculation 4 times, we do this calculation once like this. And we generally save this value in a variable so that we can use it whatever we need, right? And the value that variables are defined in Python is variable name, let's call it, to second equal, and whatever that value is that repeats itself and that we want to save into a variable. Now I want to make 2 notes here regarding the variable in Python. First of all, in Python, defining or creating a variable and giving it a value like this syntax for that is actually very simple compared to other languages, because you just have the variable name and the value. In many programming languages, you actually have to define here some kind of data type for that variable. For example, if it's a number like float or integer, or string, etc. In Python, you don't have to define that, you just have name of the variable, simple as that. The second one is the naming convention or standard for the variable. So we have two words. For example, if we name our variable calculation to seconds, right, we have actually three words here. So variables that are descriptive. So basically tells you what this value actually is about. So they have multiple words in them. You can separate them using these underlines. Again, in different languages, the naming for variables can be different in Python. This is actually one of the standard ways of defining variable with underscore, which I find pretty nice and easy to read. So we are going to use this syntax throughout the course. It will be totally and absolutely okay. If we wrote it like this, or if we use capital letters instead, but again, this is probably the most readable form, and this is what we are going to use now here. Note that we can decide whatever name we want to give our variable, but in Python, there are some specific words that have special meaning to Python. These are called reserve words. So you can't use these words as variable names, and we will use some of these reserve words throughout the course. So you will see some examples. So we have our variable defined here, and this is value that this variable gives us. So how do we replace it now? These repeating values with this variable. So we are going to delete that, and again, instead we are simply going to copy the name of the variable. So let's execute, and as you see, we have our value printed just fine, and we are going to do the same for all those values, and again execute everything that works just like before. Now you may be thinking, if we change this to minutes, we would have to change the variable in all these places. So that's our case. We can just rename our variable something more generic. So let's say calculation to units, and this could be now any unit that we want. Second, meaning it doesn't matter, and this is exactly the advantage of variable, because you can name it whatever you want, which generally just describes what this variable is about, and now you won't have to change that again. And we can also replace this one here accordingly, since it's a text. We can call it a name of unit. We can also call it unit. Doesn't really matter. We are the ones deciding what that variable name is. And once we have that variable, we can now replace it here. How do we do this? Because this is actually part of a text, a string. The name, we fit it right here. We are going to delete that and create an expression, create a syntax that generally tells Python, hey, this is not a string, this is a non-string value, and you already know this could be either number or variable itself. And so we are going to use the curly braces and the name of the variable, and just like what we have substitute these values here, and if we execute it, works perfectly fine. And we can do that in all 4 lines, and our code is still working. And this syntax right here with this format at the beginning basically prevents us, or avoids, saves us from having a bunch of plus signs here and then space characters, etc. This all looks way elegant now. And now if at some point we actually decide, what I want this program to calculate how many hours there are in the given days instead of seconds. And we want to change the program to do that. We could just change the calculation here, and instead of seconds, we have hours. And if I execute, there you go, we see the changes right away. So this is why when you are programming, doesn't matter in which language, including Python, using variables will be probably some of the most frequent thing that you do, because you always have values that are repeating themselves and you want to write clean code. So you create variables, and one of the best practices when creating and using variable is, as we are using actually here, is to name your variable so that you later and also other programmers who are working with you understand what this variable actually does or what type of value it actually has. Because you just look at 24, you would probably not know what this 24 is about, right? But with variable, you actually know that this actually represent a number that is used for calculating units, right? It could also be more descriptive, like units for days, but generally another advantage of variable is to describe that value as well that you are using in your code. So this is all about today's session. In the next session, we will work on our next coding part. So if you have any doubt, you can ask in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching.